The wall stands as the sole physical reminder of our home's true age. To the best of anyone's knowledge, the fort is among the oldest standing in the world. First built in a bygone era when the kingdom of Atnia was not but myth and anachronism, a colonial fool's errand for troublesome nobles, all too eager to prove themselves heroes of old. The names of the would-be kings and queens of the untamed jungle who first built it are lost to history. The structures in which they resided reduced to dust by centuries of wind and rain, a fate to which all human creation appears doomed. Yet the wall remains. This was the bulwark that held on the night of the revolution when 100 better-equipped fortifications in the valley collapsed in the face of the armies of darkness. To the best of anyone's knowledge, the wall has never been breached. Perhaps, some say, it was built by the Auva themselves in the Third Age. Others suggest it was built by the very gods. In the decades since the revolution, we have built 2 more walls in its image to accommodate our growing way of life. Testaments to the hard work and ingenuity of our people that they are, we afford the same reverence to neither. The gods are silent, and many choose to cast their prayers at the base of the wall instead.
Welcome to this new series where we will be making videos on specific topics within the world of Atnia, the card game and the tabletop RPG we are making within it. Today we will be talking about the Old Watch, a faction in post-apocalypse Atnia, and one of the main locations you are likely to familiarize yourself with when playing either of these games. So, Kevin, why don't you tell us a bit about the Old Watch?
Right, so the Old Watch is kind of like the beating heart of Atnia in some ways. It's the first place that was designed in this world for a TTRPG, and its core vibe is kind of this like low, dark fantasy, but also sort of tinged with hope. The Old Watch is, on the surface, a generic kind of peasant village. Like almost everyone there is a worker of some kind, a farmer or a laborer. But the more you sort of delve deeply into what the Watch is about, you realize it's not exactly ordinary. It survived the apocalypse with its powerful walls that some people now worship as almost gods unto themselves after potentially the gods died during the apocalypse, at least so some people think. And it operates on this kind of strange political structure where being a peasant and hard work is highly valued. Anything that looks like ostentation and nobility is shunned. So it comes off as this low magic, low fantasy setting, and as it turns out, it's actually because it's based very strongly on what the people around here value.
Yeah, and to be clear, the apocalypse is it was a sort of magical event that happened about 80 years before the current state of affairs in Atnia. And it was this sort of big magical rift that appeared in the sky and had all kinds of horrible things happen. But it's been 80 years since that happened, and the world is a bit safer now. And the peasants are just kind of hanging out in the Old Watch, trying to survive.
Yeah, and in that time, the Old Watch is one of these places in the world that's actually kind of flourished since the apocalypse. So, through sheer luck, so far as anyone knows, on the night of the apocalypse, when everything came crashing down and hordes of undead and arcane beasts were stalking the wilderness and the knights defending the wall were protecting it, the Old Watch was run by nobles, who were especially cruel to the peasants in this land, because Atnia, before the collapse, was a nation of magically enforced laws. That basically, they argued it created this perfect social structure and peace. So it was technically a kingdom with nobility and peasants, but the nobility weren't allowed to mistreat the peasants too poorly due to the laws. The Old Watch, or Fostfiek, as the old fort was called way back in the day, existed outside of Atnia's technical borders and outside of the magically enforced laws. And so it was the site of some of the most horrific abuses of sort of the powers of nobility at the time. And while all of the guards were distracted defending the walls, the peasants had a revolution. They took over the palace and captured all the nobles. And that's kind of the beginning of the sort of jealously guarded peasant democracy that you get from the Old Watch. A lot of people there also view magic as responsible for the apocalypse and kind of shun it and mistrust it, and it's not allowed in those walls. In the years afterwards, they had a sort of first republic, and a small democracy that actually tried to incorporate the nobles that survived the revolution. But these nobles were more sort of well-read on the nature of legality and other things than the Atnian peasants and kept trying to sort of reinsert their power in the world. And eventually they were exiled to die out in the forest. And this is sort of where the Old Watch gets its jealously guarded structure of laws. Its rules are highly codified in maybe a kind of ludicrous way sometimes. They have like exact punishments for like different types of things you might steal, for example, or different ways of trying to sort of subvert the legality of the assembly.
Yeah, so the old Atnian laws, as you mentioned, they were kind of magically enforced. So there was this idea that even though there were these different sort of classes of people, you had a nobility and knights. There was this idea that everyone was sort of equal under the law, and in reality, of course, different people had different accesses to get around said laws and had different positions within society, so they were affected by the laws differently. So it wasn't really this sort of utopian society that perhaps the creators of the magical laws might have thought they were creating, or maybe not.
It depends on your perspective in the world beforehand, I suppose. But yeah, certainly those in the Old Watch felt like they had shouldered too many burdens as peasants of this empire.
Yes, and since the old laws are gone and they've created their own peasant democracy with new laws, they seem to have retained the sort of extremely legalistic nature of, here are the laws, everyone is affected by them, and we're all going to be equal under the law, but they're kind of taking it from a different perspective.
Yeah, exactly. And so they don't use magic to enforce their laws, and instead they have kind of this system of direct democracy, at least for citizens of the Old Watch. So I guess quickly before I jump into the political system, it's also worth noting not all nobles were exiled. Nobles were given a choice because the knights who defended the wall from the hordes of monsters were also technically nobility, although lower nobility than the nobles of the palace. And the citizens of the Old Watch were very grateful for being protected by these knights, and saw them and their oaths to protect the walls as something actually like helpful and noble. So anyone with noble blood is basically given a choice. They can swear themselves to a knight on the wall, which means that they will never take interest in politics. They'll never engage in Old Watch politics, and they will give their life in defense of the walls if need be, or they can be exiled. And that's also a choice often given to criminals, is they can swear themselves to the wall rather than endure exile, which is almost a death sentence in this world.
Yeah, and during the night of the apocalypse, the knights, like the nobles were calling for the knights to come protect them, but the knights, they knew that if they would have done that, then everyone would have died. So they did their duty and protected the wall. So there's kind of this deep reverence for the Knights of the Wall, even though they are still nobility. So there's a bit of a tension there, I guess you could say.
Yeah, exactly. And the Knights also, as defenders of the wall, can sort of ride this line of taking an interest in politics. They're not technically citizens of the Watch, and they're not allowed to vote. But their words hold a lot of weight if it comes to specifically topics about defense. And so they can sort of toe that line, although they could get in a lot of trouble if they're seen as trying to manipulate people. So I guess I should get into what makes you a citizen of the Watch. Essentially, anyone born into the system of the Watch becomes a citizen, and they also have slowly been affording a process of citizenship to refugees and people from the outside who work to join the Watch. However, if you have noble blood, you can never become a citizen. Your basically best bet to gain resources in the Watch is just to swear yourself as a knight if you have any kind of noble ancestry. Citizens engage in a direct democracy of sorts, where they have an assembly called technically every day in the town square and vote on matters. Most people don't go to the daily assembly because it's usually over small matters. The way that this direct democracy works and the court system and all of this stuff, everyone technically has a right to vote on every petty dispute that people have over like every small thing, but it's kind of seen as taking an interest in politics, which is seen as sort of like trying to emulate nobility if you go to the assembly every single day for matters that don't concern you. So a lot of what you'll find when you go to the assembly on any given day is like someone accusing someone else of lying, which is technically a crime of varying degrees of severity, depending on what the lie is about in the Old Watch, and other sort of like petty local drama is often going on. But then occasionally, the assembly will actually have really important things to vote on. Like, for example, how the harvest dole is apportioned. So during the major harvests, you end up with a whole surplus of food that has to get divided around the watch. And there's always a giant political drama as to who should be awarded what. It's usually passed through the various workers' guilds in different ways, and the apportioning is generally equal and fair, but not always quite sane. So, like, one thing that might happen is if you have, like, an apple orchard or, like, some blueberries and things, you end up in a situation where every farmer in the Farmers Guild is awarded exactly 12 blueberries, which, what are you meant to do with that exactly? And so the secondary social role of chefs has kind of cropped up in the Watch that has its own sort of power and legal structure.
Yeah, the chefs are a really interesting concept to me because you kind of have this sort of informal structure coming in to sort of correct for and meet the needs of people whose needs are not really being met by the sort of formal huge voting process, because it ends up getting more involved in sort of the petty politics of the village, and then people just end up with a lot of random food, so everybody just kind of shoves their food in a big communal pile and has someone cook it, right? And I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, and so most chefs are still citizens of the Watch, but because chefs were kind of seen as like having too much political power because people would bring them their food and they would cook for them, most people tend to trust their own local chef that they bring their food to, but be mistrustful of chefs in other parts of the Watch that they don't know and view them as potentially like working towards nobility and other such things. And this isn't unprecedented. Like, chef cults have been a problem in the Watch's history. Isn't like a chef essentially using their weird political status and how much people need them to like actually become a kind of cult leader or something like that. So because of all of this, chefs or cooking isn't considered labor in the context of the Watch. So chefs aren't actually given their own food in the context of the dole, and they actually have to rely on their neighbors giving them stuff to work with to be able to eat. Some other small details, I suppose, is that the way the basic political system works is everyone gets a vote on most things. Most votes are decided by majority. So, for example, if there's a trial going on, everyone gets to write their name on a stone and cast it into a great urn in the middle of the assembly, and the majority vote wins. There are some contexts, though, where it's actually done randomly. There are two councils that sort of have a little bit more political power in the Watch. The first is the Peasants' Council, and the second is the Defense Council. The Peasants' Council is in charge of organizing the assembly. So while everyone comes and votes on issues, the Peasants' Council actually decides what's on the agenda for any given day, and organizes stuff that way. And there's a certain political power to agenda setting, so they're often viewed with some amount of suspicion. They're also not allowed to vote while they're serving on the assembly, or while they're serving on the Peasants' Council. The Peasants' Council is elected in regular elections, and these elections are done by lottery. So everyone puts the name of someone they wish to become a representative in the Peasants' Council on a stone and puts it in the urn, and then 5 names are drawn out, and those are the members of the Peasants' Council for that amount of time. The Defense Council, on the other hand, is unappointed leaders, and there's some amount of concern around it because it technically has sort of power to veto Peasants' Council and even assembly decisions when it comes to topics of Old Watch defense. They deal with sensitive materials, secrets about magic that are deemed unsafe for the average person to know, and they're sort of peopled with representatives from each of the major guilds, as well as some of the major factions that aren't necessarily part of the citizenry of the Old Watch. So, for example, there's a Knight on the Wall who is always apportioned member of the Defense Council, and even the Scouts and the Inkbloods, who we'll get into later, who aren't exactly members of the Watch at all, do get to send representatives to meet with the Defense Council.
Yeah, and to be clear, when he said lottery, the process is essentially random. Like, the probabilities are determined by how you're voting for who you want as your representative, but then which person actually gets chosen is random based on the distribution of odds there.
Yeah, which is sort of inspired by historical examples of democracy. I know some people who are familiar with it know that a similar thing existed in Athens in ancient Greece.
Yeah, that's sort of the one of the famous, I guess, direct democracies in history, and it's kind of got this almost slight mythology to it in a historical sense, but I guess we won't go too much into that.
But I guess one useful feature about this election via lottery thing is it does make it harder for someone who really wants to sort of pursue political power to consistently have access to it. And also because often random people who aren't as familiar with the political system will end up just becoming elected representatives by happenstance. It ends up onboarding people in random parts of the community to having a lot more knowledge about the political process that they can help and share with their neighbors, essentially, is one of the theories sort of behind it.
Yeah, and a lot of the sort of politics of the Old Watch and general culture of the people, as you've sort of probably noticed by now, is very centered around avoiding having a new nobility, because they were not doing too great under the old nobility, and they're trying really hard to prevent falling into any situation like that again. And they're doing it to more or less success depending on the situation. Things aren't always going perfectly, but as a whole, this is like generally their goal.
Yeah, and I think you can sort of make your own opinions about it. I didn't want to create this as a society that was like great or terrible, but more complicated and interesting. So I hope I succeed in that as you get to explore this place more.
Yeah, it has its ups and downs.
Yeah. So kind of moving on, we've touched on some of the factions that exist, or sort of sub-factions that exist inside of the Watch, but to enumerate those in more detail, the major factions that have a lot of pull in the Watch are the guilds, and most of these guilds are just sort of mundane guilds of workers. So for example, like the Builders Guild, the Farmers Guild, and the Miners Guild are some of the most influential guilds within the Watch. There are also smaller sort of mundane guilds, like for example, there's an Herbalists Guild and other things like that don't have quite as much political pull, but are still respected as hard workers within the walls. Like there are apiarists, all kinds of other things like that. Another guild that also sort of counts among the mundane guilds, as well as a powerful one, but sort of stands apart from them, is the Scribes Guild. So back when the Old Watch had its little revolution, most of the revolutionaries couldn't actually like read or write themselves, and it's kind of a testament to how much the Watch has advanced and changed in the ensuing couple of generations that most children raised in the Watch now can. So back during that time, they didn't really think much when they were making an archive to just hold the records of the old nobility. But those who could read and write quickly became a kind of central feature of the Watch as they started having to plan farming and other things for an increasingly growing population, as refugees also found their way on their doorstep and other things. And having a record of like census keeping records, knowledge of how each individual farm in the growing Watch appears to be doing. One of the things that happened throughout history is, so there's an initial ring of walls that kind of guards the palace, and that's grown really crowded on the inside, so they've actually built 2 larger layers of walls to protect farmland and other things. And it's just a lot to keep track of, and so the scribes kind of form this really important role in that sense. They also transcribe everything that happens in the assembly, which becomes a useful public resource at this point. They copy official records, and they also are increasingly gathering knowledge about what's going on in the outside world, about magic, and about defending yourself outside the wall, as the roads are getting just a little bit safer, and brave outlanders are taking their time to sort of travel into the outside world and see what might be out there. The scribe's knowledge is sort of indispensable in this.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, there have been sort of refugees coming to the Old Watch, because after the apocalypse, the Old Watch is essentially a fortress. So after the apocalypse, a lot of people just kind of came running towards it as like the only remotely safe place around, and they've kind of had to incorporate a lot of these other peoples into this sort of peasant democracy to varying degrees. I guess to talk a little bit about the geography as well of the Old Watch, it is on like sort of the side of a mountain, like between the mountain and some woods. So the inner wall is basically a fortress. Then the middle wall is a bit bigger. It has a lot of just general town stuff, a lot of buildings and things. And the third wall, the outer wall, is much larger. It's the most recent construction, and it is large enough to like surround the nearest woods, for example.
Yeah, and these serve as like differing lines of defense. Like obviously the outer wall can't be as tall as the inner wall because it just has to cover so much land. So that's where most of the refugees who haven't been onboarded as citizens in the Old Watch end up staying, and they're still not completely safe because in reality, if there was to be a large sort of invasion from monsters, the knights would likely end up retreating to the middle wall to regroup, which would put them in a lot of danger. And obviously the central wall is technically the most defensible, but if they ever had to fall back to there, they just wouldn't have access to their food. So in serious defense plans, the middle wall is kind of seen as the main line of defense for the Watch. And I guess I should talk a little bit about the political status of these refugees. Refugees are kind of allowed to trade and barter their labor for food with the Watch, and if they do a really good job, they might be onboarded as citizens. But they sort of now, because there are significantly more refugees coming in than there are citizens of the Watch, they've kind of become a pseudo underclass in a way. This is one of the ways that the Old Watch has kind of failed to not recreate these structures of nobility, is that the refugees are kind of performing a lot of labor for the Watch in ways that doesn't always that often gets kind of taken advantage of, as they're sort of expected to work for years under a nebulous expectation of maybe sometime becoming citizens. So I guess touching on some of the other sub-factions, the Wall Knights are obviously another sub-faction. We've kind of talked about them a lot already. They swear an oath to defend the wall and are allowed sort of some of the privileges of nobility in the context of the Watch, so long as that they don't take an interest in politics. They're viewed as less suspicious than other random citizens if they are to carry like a banner of their family name or something like that. Like that kind of thing is sort of allowed because they're seen as like the good kind of noble almost, truly defending the peasants from threats outside and not attempting to dominate them. Another major faction is the Scouts. So back at the beginning, when the nobles were all sort of exiled from the Watch, some of them didn't actually die. Stuff has gotten weird and magical in the outside world, and some of these nobles ended up, although they had no ability to necessarily survive on their own, making pacts with creatures of the forest and the forest themselves. So there's one famous story of one of the exiled nobles crawling and starving out into the woods is being led off by a fox who just keeps kind of luring him away, curious to see what will happen. And he keeps chasing this fox because he needs something to eat, thinking that this is going to be food. And the fox is first being playful and maybe even a little cruel, leading this man to his death. But then he kind of takes pity on him, seeing this noble crawling towards him. And the fox comes closer and offers the man a trade. And the man trades his eyes with the fox, and the fox now has human eyes and can see the world in human ways, and the noble has a fox's eyes and can see the forest in a new light, and it's just enough to find himself food. And so these few nobles eventually who have done similar things or found their ways to survive in the forest regroup together, and they end up also joining with other sort of tribes and groups of outlanders and become more populated with orcs and sort of indigenous Atnians, and develop their own culture that kind of blends nobility with indigenous Atnian culture in some very unique ways. And they eventually return to the Watch and become kind of a useful resource, although in a sort of tenuous alliance, because a lot of these nobles still sort of blame the deaths of older family members on the Old Watch, and the Old Watch is still increasingly mistrustful of them, because now not only are they nobles, but they're also sort of magical and not quite human anymore.
So I would just ask that you clarify, because when you're first telling me about this, it wasn't exactly clear to me how literally we should be interpreting the sort of story around the nobles sort of becoming more animal-like within the sort of magical forest. So I guess just enlighten everyone as to...
Yeah, so it's very literal. So like some of these nobles are actually like full-on hybrids with animals, and it depends. Like different people found ways to survive in other ways, but like one thing that some of these nobles discovered and has become a feature of the culture is sort of making pacts with the forest and creatures outside in order to gain some of their strengths while also giving up some of your humanity and giving these creatures sort of their own boons. It's kind of like if you're familiar with D&D, like druid or ranger magic almost, but it's a little bit more sort of transformative, arcane, and strange.
And this forest that they're in is not the third wall, the forest within the third wall. It's outside of that, correct?
Yeah. This is kind of what happens when you go into the deep woods on the outside.
And this is like, this is just a characteristic of this sort of magical forest near Atnia, or is this something that sort of surrounds Atnia as a whole?
This kind of thing can happen anywhere in Atnia as a whole for people who know how to do it. But there also is some particular magic to the forest around the Old Watch, which I don't really want to talk too much more about without spoilers. But yeah.
And I suppose next up will be the Inkbloods.
Yeah, so not that far after the Revolution, the Old Watch was contacted by strange tattooed mages from a nearby tower. And as much as they don't allow any type of magic within as far as even the second wall, they do find both of these kind of outside factions as incredibly useful to them because they can scout the outside world. The Inkbloods offer deals of incredible power. They're heavily untrusted within the Watch, but the Inkbloods are still quite useful. And one of the things that they noticed actually is some of the people they exile, so for crimes and things, end up returning as tattooed mages picked up by the Inkbloods. And so in some ways it's a way of disposing of people who are wrong to the Watch, because the Inkbloods seem to be willing to take on just about anyone.
And do the members of the Old Watch know much more about the Inkbloods, or is that really the extent of their knowledge, and it's just kind of suspicion and rumors beyond that?
I think the extent of the knowledge of most people. The Defense Council knows a little bit more, and I think if we're talking about it in the tabletop RPG sense, you can play as an Inkblood, so you might learn a little bit more when the Inkbloods, when they have their magical tattoos sort of embedded in them and all of this stuff, they start getting whispers from the Rift and these other voices telling them about the laws of the world. Their magics are kind of bound up in Atnian laws, as well as concepts of like writing and ideas. So I think that's all we need to say for now. We might do a more in-depth video on the Inkbloods sometime later.
Yeah, I was gonna leave them on even more of a cliffhanger than that and just say we'll do that in the next episode of the series or something.
Yeah, that sounds great. With all of this in mind, there are kind of all of these internal factions within the Old Watch, and the roads are slowly becoming safer, and there's value to trade because people are realizing there are other factions of survivors out there in the world. So the Old Watch is sending out more Outlanders to go and explore the roads. Outlanders in the Old Watch are viewed with some amount of suspicion, as if you are able to travel outside the walls, there's a fear that you're going to become tainted with magic of some kind. So an Old Watch Outlander looks like a variety of things. So obviously the Scouts and the Inkbloods work with the Old Watch to go and travel the roads outside, but also within the Watch, Knights and Scribes in particular, those guilds often train people with some of the tools to travel the roads. Scribes are in particular trained to be able to run quickly, record notes about the outside, using kind of this shorthand known as Scribe Scratch, and bring useful things back, either knowledge of magic or knowledge of herbs or where you can find various things. Even just maps are highly useful. So this is kind of some of the things that are going on within the Watch. And it's part of why the Scribes Guild is also viewed as sort of outside of the other mundane guilds, as they're viewed with a little bit of suspicion as having more to do with magic than the other guilds, even if they don't necessarily do magic themselves.
Yeah, and as sort of implied there, I believe most of the sort of peasants of the Watch, and even some of the refugees possibly, they don't really leave the third wall ever, just because it's safer on the inside, and their whole society is sort of structured around being within these walls, and being able to get this knowledge of the outside world is rather valuable to them for that reason.
Yeah, exactly. But it does sort of conflict with this Old Watch citizen common sort of suspicion of magic and also just general xenophobia towards anything from the outside or strange. And this kind of ties in with common beliefs that are held about the apocalypse. There are a lot of beliefs that are held about the apocalypse around the world, and we'll probably talk about what the other factions think about the apocalypse in future videos. But the Old Watch, it's really common for them to think that it's the archmages, the great mages that sort of dominated the various societies before the apocalypse, who brought it about, that it was brought about by a war between the archmages, and that the gods either died or forsook humanity in that time, seeing them as now beneath their notice and having sinned too far. So the Old Watch tends to view magic as kind of part of the problem itself, essentially, and that it's not going to be a problem that will be resolved with magic. So yeah, I guess we'll close out by just covering the perspectives that people in the Old Watch will have on other factions. So the other sort of major factions, for example, like there's the Knights of Redemption, who in some ways the Old Watch is very similar to, but in other ways they're almost diametrically opposed to. In kind of the far mountains on the other side of Atnia, in a palace in the middle of a lake, there is a civilization of both peasants and nobles, where instead of the peasants ruling, the nobles rule. And there are all of these different orders of knights there. And these are kind of different from the nobles that existed prior to the apocalypse in Atnia. A lot of them really do fall on their sword to defend the peasants and train for years and years to be powerful enough to defend the weak within their lands. And they have a similar kind of practical judiciousness as to the Old Watch, but they mess with magic, and they have a structure of nobility. And the Old Watch mistrusts them for these reasons, even though they might also prove as sort of natural allies in some ways. The other thing that's important to note is the Knights of Redemption allow in their court anyone with a noble title to join them, and they're not really too concerned over whether you are part of a proper noble line from before Atnia. If you are a knight who has sworn yourself to an oath and defend people, you are welcome in the court of these knights, which means that they have an open invitation to the Knights of the Wall, which can prove as potentially some tension in the future with other members of the Old Watch.
Yeah, and I guess we should talk about one thing, which is, what is the actual scale of Atnia? Because Atnia is like this sort of one continent within the broader world, and since the apocalypse, I believe nobody has really left Atnia. And how big is Atnia?
Atnia is like kind of the size of like maybe a mid-sized European country. Like you can picture it as maybe like the size of like France or something like that. And yeah, no one has actually heard really word from the outside, at least that anyone knows of now. And it's kind of surrounded mostly by mountains, by a great gorge on one side. There was a bridge over to the nearby nation of Lekvia that's broken down. You might be able to leave by boat, but no one really knows at this point.
And next up would be the Salt Alliance, which is another sort of even more ragtag group that is surviving after the apocalypse.
Yeah, the Salt Alliance was initially kind of a band of resistance fighters, freedom fighters, before the collapse of Atnia, surviving in the mountains and attempting to go on raids and sort of cut off Atnia's resources in any way they could. They're often made up a lot of sort of indigenous people from before Atnia's collapse, as well as bandits, runaway soldiers, other things like that. And they've had their own surplus of refugees since the apocalypse. They sort of exist in these in caves up in the mountains and other parts. Again, you'll notice this is a theme that most of the sort of civilizations of the apocalypse live sort of in the ring of mountains, and the valley has become much more dangerous in this time. And they carry on a lot more of sort of these indigenous Atnian cultural norms. They have a lot more like orcs and goblins and ogres among them. And currently in the Old Watch, they're probably just viewed as mostly a horde of monsters, although the Old Watch might find that they have more in common with the Salt Alliance than they think if negotiations ever were to start coming about.
And another sort of mysterious group that the members of the Old Watch might have minimal contact with would be the Forsaken. What do they think of the Forsaken?
Yeah, so the Forsaken are really interesting because they as a faction believe that that the gods have abandoned everyone or are dead, and that this is actually a good thing. That much like the society that existed beforehand, the gods themselves were something constraining us all to be stuck in these predestined paths, and now mortal people have sort of their own choice of their destiny now that the gods are gone. They mess a lot with sort of dream magic and teleporting between the planes. They might come to people in their dreams, and so the Old Watch might be really suspicious of them for their sort of illusions and magical powers, but on the other hand, they might be the ideologically closest faction to the Old Watch, as people who really believe that the powers of the old society need to be completely dismantled.
Yeah, the Forsaken also sort of have this kind of egalitarian ethos to them, perhaps to, in some cases, greater success, and it's kind of infused with this kind of existentialist philosophy and general magical use of the sort of dream realm that exists within the world of Atnia.
Yeah, well, it's a different kind of success. So whereas the Old Watch is like very hard in this direction of we must have these strict laws and do things according to this exact process, the Forsaken don't really police their members at all and just kind of do what they want, believing imposing power on one another is kind of this negative thing. So some Forsaken you encounter may actually be kind of cultists, like doing sort of crazy things, whereas each individual Forsaken is going to be very different from another one that you might meet.
Yeah, and they're not like one collective unit. There's sort of many smaller groups of Forsaken. Perhaps some of them will have different cultures and things that they're doing.
Yeah, and the way that they sort of are tied together is both their knowledge of dream magic, which they share with one another to sort of onboard other Forsaken, as well as the communities they protect. And the dream magic is kind of more powerful. Well, this is for later. This is for a Forsaken video, actually. That doesn't touch on what the Old Watch knows about them.
Second to last will be the Fifth Legion, which is actually part of the remnants of the old Atnian military. So, maybe Old Watch not really looking upon them too fondly?
Yeah, I think they're probably the most likely to be opposed to the Old Watch, because they're also trying to sort of restore old Atnia, much like the Knights of Redemption, but there's less for the Old Watch to kind of relate to them on, even, as they're this rigid militaristic structure. They're often kind of keeping the peasant villages that supply their soldiers under a semi-military rule. I think they're probably the most directly opposed of the factions to the Old Watch.
And finally, there would be the Pale Mages, which are a bit of an interesting group.
Yeah, this isn't exactly as much of a playable faction for the most part in the tabletop RPG, but they are important to mention in the context of the Watch because they're one of the other sort of post-apocalypse or they're the closest post-apocalypse civilization to the Old Watch, and so kind of likely to be the first for them to encounter and react to. The Pale Mages worship this god called the Pale Sun, a sun that exists deep beneath their mountain that they reside in, and it sort of leeches all the color and life out of stuff around it, and they have to give it constant sacrifices to keep this fire burning. But in exchange for these sacrifices, they are capable of performing true miracles. Magic that does not appear to be arcane, it doesn't draw monsters, and it doesn't have the same kind of aura that other arcane magic does, so it might be seen as a little bit more trustworthy by the Watch. It seems like proper divine magic, which is not commonly seen since the gods have stopped speaking to their clerics. And what's more, divine magic right now relies on people taking power out of existing magical artifacts, because the gods have blessed certain items around the world, and that's a very limited resource. So the Old Watch trusts divine magic a lot more than it does arcane magic, but these limited sort of artifacts that exist make it a very sort of scarce resource and something that they don't want to use too much of. But it seems like so long as the Pale Mage has an offering of any kind, an offering of life, they are capable of just casting endless divine magic. So they might have access to sort of one of the only true gods left in the world. They're a little bit xenophobic, and but that's also something that might accord with the Old Watch's belief. So it will be sort of interesting to see how the Old Watch handles this new faction when they encounter them.
Yeah, and what kind of divine magic, what would they actually be doing with this divine magic that the Old Watch would know about? Like, what kind of magic have they seen done, maybe?
So in their first encounters, and I don't think this has sort of like happened yet at the day zero, is they might encounter each other like seeking a similar relic, or they're outlanders kind of running into each other, and they would see that the Pale Mages, by draining the life and offering the plants and life around them to their great fire back in their mountain, are capable of casting fireballs, of healing, of producing all kinds of all variety of miracles, conjuring food into being.
Yeah, interesting. And I suppose that's about it for the major factions that the Old Watch will be likely to be interacting with immediately after the sort of day zero of where we're going to be picking up with the world of Atnia, setting-wise, when we're going with our sort of overall narrative beginning and tabletop RPG games, perhaps. So that would be, I guess, about it for our lore dump on the Old Watch. I guess you can stay tuned for further lore dumps in the future. And we will also be creating some more short videos about the card game mechanics and perhaps the tabletop RPG mechanics as well. If you would like a video going over the overall world of Atnia, just a huge overview of all of the different things within it, we have an hour-long video on that that's going to be linked below. And look forward to more deep dives on specific things within the world of Atnia.
Thank you for listening. See you in the next one. Lucas awoke to the blissfully rancid scent of manure, carried across the harvest fields of the middle wall and through the cracks in the dark wood planks of his shack on a cool morning breeze. He filled his lungs. I might well be the last traditionalist, he thought, savoring the stench. The Old Watch was falling away to nobility and waste, he was sure. He stretched his arms above him and lurched his creaking bones towards the sky, closing his eyes in serene rapture, despite the strain. He might as well have been climbing to the heavens themselves. He slid his legs from his bed and opened his eyes again, scanning the cluttered little hovel for where he had cast his plain working garments and wide-brimmed leather sun hat. Too long had the younger generations enjoyed the comfort and plenty and safety of the outer wall. They knew nothing of the battles that had been fought to purify the soil of the twin corruptions of decadence and witchcraft. It was the greatest of ironies, he thought, that the children for whom they had made this haven would be the ones to welcome its decay with open arms. No, to invite it in their very hearts.